It was another long day at the office, the kind where the hours seemed to blend together in a haze of meetings, emails, and tasks that never seemed to end. She sat at her desk, staring at the screen, mindlessly scrolling through the same documents she'd been working on all day. She'd always prided herself on her work ethic, never one to leave before everything was done, but tonight something felt different. Her boss, the billionaire who ran the company, was usually busy with his own schedule. He was a man of few words, commanding, but not unkind. She knew him more by reputation than by direct interaction. Most of the employees were in awe of him, some even intimidated, but she was different. She had been working here for a few years, had seen the way the company ran, and understood the pressure he was under. Still, despite knowing all this, there was an unspoken distance between them. He rarely spoke to anyone outside of work matters, and even then, he kept his interactions brief. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her assistant. "He wants to see you in his office." The message was simple, but it sent a rush of nerves through her. She had no idea what this meeting could be about. Her job as an executive assistant didn't usually require direct involvement with him unless there was an issue that needed to be addressed. She was used to coordinating, arranging schedules, and taking care of details. But now, her heart rate picked up, and her thoughts raced. What could he possibly want? She glanced at the time. It was already late, the office nearly empty. Most people had gone home for the day. She quickly straightened her blazer and made her way down the corridor toward his office. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet hall as she approached the door. When she knocked, there was a soft, "Come in," and she entered. He was sitting behind his massive desk, looking at something on his laptop. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from his computer screen. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Please, take a seat." She sat down across from him, trying to read his expression. He didn't look particularly happy or upset, just calm, his usual demeanor, but there was something different in the way he held himself tonight, something that made her uneasy, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. "Thank you for coming. On such short notice," he began, his voice deep and controlled. "I need to discuss something with you, something a bit unusual." She nodded, her curiosity piqued. The atmosphere felt tense in a way she couldn't explain, and she wasn't sure if it was because of the late hour or because of the way he was speaking. His tone, though still measured, had a hint of something else, almost as if he was uncertain about what he was about to say. He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts, before he finally spoke again. "I have a charity gala tomorrow evening. It's a major event, and I need a partner for the evening." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze not leaving her face. "I want you to accompany me, but there's a catch. You'll need to pretend to be my wife." Her mind spun for a moment. She wasn't sure if she'd heard him correctly. Pretend to be his wife? The billionaire who ran one of the largest companies in the world was asking her, an assistant, to play such a role? The words felt out of place, foreign even. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out at first. "I know it's an unusual request," he continued, almost as if reading her thoughts. "But it's important. The media will be there. And there are some situations I need to control. I need to project an image of stability, of family." His explanation did nothing to ease the confusion she was feeling. She had always known that his life outside of the office was shrouded in mystery, but this felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she wanted to cross. She opened her mouth again, this time managing to get words out. "But why me?" He gave her a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I trust you. You've been with the company for years now, and you understand the importance of discretion. There's no one else I'd feel comfortable asking." She felt the weight of his words. Trust. It was the one thing that seemed to matter most in the world he inhabited. Trust and control. She had worked hard to build that trust with him over the years, but this felt like something different, more personal. She wondered what it would mean for their professional relationship if she agreed. The silence between them stretched on. She had always been a professional, always willing to do whatever was necessary for the job. But this felt like a different kind of commitment. "What's the catch?" she finally asked, her voice quieter than she intended. He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious now. "There's only one rule," he said, his voice lowering. "You can't ask any questions. Not tonight. No questions about why or what or anything else. I just need you to play the role, for one evening." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, all she could do was process them. No questions? The billionaire who always had a plan, who always seemed to know exactly what he was doing, was now asking her to play a part in something. Uncertain. She didn't understand, but the thought of saying no, of turning down the request, felt even more difficult. Her mind raced, weighing the consequences of either choice. She could decline, but it might change things between them, change her position in the company. Or she could agree, step into this strange role, and hope it was as simple as he made it sound. "I need your answer tonight," he said, interrupting her thoughts. His voice softened as if sensing her hesitation. "I won't ask again." She looked at him, trying to read his face, his eyes, searching for any sign that this was all just some kind of test, a joke, or something less serious. But there was nothing. He was calm, composed, and completely serious. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "All right, I'll do it." He didn't smile, but his gaze softened, a small glimmer of appreciation in his eyes. "Thank you. I knew I could count on you." The day of the gala arrived sooner than she expected. The hours before the event felt like they were slipping away, and despite everything, she found herself unable to focus on anything other than the night ahead. She had agreed to play the part of his wife, but what did that even mean? What was she supposed to do? How was she supposed to behave? She spent most of the day getting ready, picking out a dress she had never worn before, something elegant, something that would fit the part. The dress was deep red, simple yet sophisticated with delicate lace details. It wasn't something she would usually wear, but tonight was not about her personal style. It was about fitting in with a role that felt foreign, one that had nothing to do with her usual life at the office. The hours seemed to drag as she prepared herself. She tried to think of what to say if anyone asked her anything. What was the story? How would she explain herself? She couldn't keep thinking like this. She had agreed to this, and now she needed to focus on getting through the night. She had to make it look like everything was fine. As she stared at her reflection in the mirror, she felt an unfamiliar sense of nervousness. She had always been composed at work, always in control. But this was different. This wasn't a conference or a meeting. This was personal, something deeper. She was about to step into a world that didn't belong to her. What would happen after tonight? Would it change everything? When the time came, she received a message from him. "I'll be in the lobby in 30 minutes. Don't be late." She couldn't remember the last time she felt so jittery about something so simple. She had been to countless corporate events, had dealt with billionaires and power players before, but this was different. She wasn't just an assistant tonight. She was pretending to be someone she wasn't, someone important, someone worthy of being beside him. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She grabbed her clutch, slipped on her shoes, and walked out of her apartment, hoping everything would fall into place once she arrived. The drive to the venue was quiet, the city lights flashing past in a blur. Her mind was filled with questions, none of which she could answer. She kept telling herself that it was just for one night, a role. It wasn't real. But the more she repeated that, the more complicated it became. She wasn't sure anymore where the role ended and where the real emotions began. When she arrived at the venue, the scale of it all took her breath away. The building was enormous, its glass walls reflecting the city skyline in the distance. Security was tight, as it always was at events like this, and the lobby was filled with elegantly dressed guests, mingling, laughing, their conversations a soft hum in the air. She stood for a moment, unsure of where to go. She wasn't used to, This world, the world of high society, of endless wealth and power, it felt like she didn't belong, like she was about to be exposed for the imposter she felt she was. Just as she was about to make her way to the entrance, she felt a hand gently touch her shoulder. She turned around, and there he was. The billionaire. He was dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly in place. His eyes, as always, were steady, intense, but there was something else there too. A flicker of uncertainty, though it was gone as soon as it appeared. "You look stunning," he said, his voice soft but firm. It was a compliment, but there was something about the way he said it that made her feel exposed, as if she had been seen for the first time in a long while. She managed a smile, trying to keep things casual. "Thank you," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor she couldn't hide. He studied her for a moment before offering his arm. "Shall we?" She nodded, taking his arm and walking beside him. The world around them seemed to fade as they entered the main hall. The room was magnificent, filled with sparkling chandeliers and long tables adorned with fine china. The guests were already scattered throughout, talking in groups, exchanging pleasantries, but as soon as they entered, all eyes were on them. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the curiosity, the unspoken judgment. They were a spectacle, an unlikely pair. Him, the billionaire, with his well-groomed appearance and commanding presence, and her, the assistant, standing beside him in a dress that didn't belong to her. She was playing a role, but for a moment it didn't feel like a game. It felt real. Too real. They made their way through the crowd, and she followed his lead. She smiled when she needed to, nodded politely at the people who greeted them, but all the while she felt like she was floating, disconnected from the moment. She was aware of how everyone was watching them, how everyone was whispering behind their hands. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers weren't about the billionaire. They were about her. His grip on her arm was gentle, but there was an unspoken message in his touch. He was in control. This was his world, his event, and she was just an accessory for the night. The thought stung, but she quickly dismissed it. This was all temporary, just one night, one evening of pretending. As the night wore on, the conversations began to blur together. There was talk of business, of charity, of future plans, and all the things she knew well, but the context felt different now. The guests didn't see her as an assistant anymore. They saw her as his wife, his partner. The idea unsettled her. She wasn't sure what she expected from the night, but it wasn't this. There were moments when she caught him looking at her, his eyes more focused than they had ever been during their time working together. There was an intensity in his gaze that was hard to ignore, and yet he remained distant, as if keeping her at arm's length even though they were standing so close. One of the other guests, a woman she had never seen before, approached them with a smile. She was wearing a bright green dress, a contrast to the elegant black and white of the room. She immediately turned to the billionaire, greeting him like an old friend. "Is this your lovely wife?" the woman asked, her eyes scanning her up and down. The question was innocent enough, but there was an edge to it, a challenge that made her skin prickle. The billionaire's expression didn't change, but he nodded, his arm still around her waist. "Yes, this is my wife," he said, his voice smooth, but the words felt like they were carefully chosen. The woman smiled, but there was something in the way her gaze lingered on her that made her uncomfortable. She felt like an object on display, something to be appraised, but she held her ground, returning the smile politely. As the woman walked away, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was a small moment, but it shook her more than she expected. The role she was playing wasn't just about looking the part. It was about being accepted, being part of something that didn't belong to her. It was about belonging to him in some strange way. For the rest of the evening, she did her best to maintain the facade. She laughed when necessary, smiled when necessary, but inside, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up, this game of pretend. Finally, as the night drew to a close, the billionaire led her toward the exit. The grand hall was slowly emptying out, the guests dispersing in groups, heading for their cars and taxis. She felt exhausted, her smile becoming harder to maintain. He turned to her just before they stepped outside. "Thank you," he said again, his voice softer now. "You were perfect tonight." She smiled, but it didn't feel like enough. The night had changed something, but she wasn't sure what. All she knew was that it wasn't over. Something had shifted between them, and she didn't know if it was something she could undo. The morning after the gala was like stepping into a different world. The buzz of the previous night, the excitement, the pressure, it all felt distant now. She woke up to the soft light of early morning filtering through her curtains, but the weight of what had happened still hung over her. She had agreed to play a role, and for one night she had done so without question. But now she found herself questioning everything. The gala was a blur in her memory. The people, the conversations, the way they looked at her, none of it felt real. She had spent hours in that ballroom, pretending to be someone she wasn't, and yet there was no denying how it had felt when he had looked at her. Really looked at her. His gaze had been different that night, more focused, more intense. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something had changed between them. The way he had spoken to her at the end of the night, thanking her, his voice softer than usual. It felt like more than just a professional gesture. She wasn't sure if it was just her imagination, but it seemed as though there was an unspoken connection, something deeper than the role she had played. Still, the reality of the situation was clear. She was his assistant. She was there to help him, not to play pretend in a world she didn't belong to, and yet, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the boundaries between them had blurred, even if just for a night. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from him, just like every other work-related message, short and to the point. "Meeting at 10 a.m., don't be late," she sighed, rubbing her eyes as she sat up in bed. Another workday, another round of tasks, but this time things felt different. She had seen him in a way she never had before. The professional distance between them, which had always been clear, was now not so clear. She wasn't sure if it was because of the gala or because of the way he had looked at her, but something had shifted. She spent the next hour getting ready, trying to focus on the tasks at hand, trying to push the thoughts of last night from her mind. She had agreed to be his wife for one night. It was a role, and it didn't need to mean anything more than that. But the more she tried to convince herself, the more uncertain she became. When she arrived at the office, the usual routine was in full swing. People were bustling about, phones were ringing, emails were flying. It felt like any other day. But as she made her way to his office, she couldn't help but notice that the tension in the air felt heavier than usual. She knocked on his door and entered when she heard his voice. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city below, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn when she walked in, but she could sense the change in his demeanor. He seemed distracted. "You're here," he said, his voice low and almost absent. He didn't offer her a seat, and she didn't take one. They both stood there for a moment, unsure of how to begin. "I know you probably have a lot of questions about last night," he finally said, his back still turned to her. She hesitated, not sure how to respond. He had made it clear the night before that there were no questions allowed, but now it felt like he was opening the door to something more. "I'm just trying to process everything," she said, her voice quiet. He turned to face her, his gaze steady. "I understand," he said, his tone softer than usual. "It wasn't meant to be easy." She raised an eyebrow, surprised by the honesty in his voice. He had always been professional, but never this vulnerable. What was it meant to be then? He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "It was meant to be a way to protect myself, to protect my image." She nodded slowly, though part of her still didn't fully understand. She had known the gala had been a business move, a way to project an image of stability, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was something deeper going on. "I never intended for it to get complicated," he continued, as if reading her thoughts, "but I can't ignore the fact that it has." The air between them felt heavier now, charged with a tension that hadn't been there before. She didn't know what he meant by that, but she had a sinking feeling she was about to find out. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice low. "Last night wasn't about you or me. It was about protecting my business, protecting my privacy." He looked at her and she saw something in his eyes, a mixture of regret and something else, something she couldn't quite place. "But that doesn't mean I didn't appreciate what you did." His words hung in the air and she felt a flicker of something inside her. He was thanking her, but it didn't feel like just a simple thank you. It felt more like an apology, an admission of something that neither of them had fully acknowledged. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. She had agreed to this, but now that the night was over, the truth felt different. "I understand," she said finally, her voice steady even though her thoughts were anything but. "But you have to understand too. This isn't something I can do every time. I'm here to work, not to play a role." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know. I don't expect anything more from you." They stood there in silence for a moment, both of them processing the conversation. It was clear to her now that things had changed. He wasn't just her boss anymore. He had let her see a side of him that most people never got to see. A side that was vulnerable, that needed something more than just professional interactions. And for the first time, she realized that she wasn't just working for him. She was part of something bigger, something that she wasn't sure she was ready for. "Let's focus on the work," she said finally, breaking the silence. "We'll keep things professional." He gave her a small nod, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Professional," he echoed, though his voice was distant, almost as if he was trying to convince himself as much as he was convincing her. The rest of the day passed in a blur. They worked side by side, discussing contracts, deadlines, and meetings. But beneath it all, the tension remained. It was in the way he glanced at her, in the way she found herself avoiding his gaze. It was in the silence that hung between them when the office quieted down, and it was just the two of them left. She knew things had changed, but she wasn't sure what that meant for their future. She had agreed to play his wife for one night, and now she wondered if that night had set something in motion that neither of them could control. The days after the gala passed in a strange haze. She went through the motions of her daily life, arriving at the office, managing schedules, emails, and calls as usual. But there was a new tension in the air that neither of them addressed directly. The gala was supposed to be over, a one-night event that would fade into memory, yet its effects lingered between them, subtle and undeniable. At first, she tried to act as if nothing had changed. She reminded herself that she was an assistant and he was her boss. Nothing more. Yet every time she walked past his office, she caught a glimpse of him staring out the window, lost in thought, as if replaying the night over and over again. When their eyes met, there was a flicker of recognition, something unspoken that neither dared to name. Then came the day that changed everything. She had been in the office since early morning, preparing documents for a major meeting when his assistant knocked lightly on her door. "He's expecting you in his office," she said, her tone neutral but with a hint of urgency. She nodded, a little apprehensive. There was something about the way she said it, the slight pause that made her heart race. She straightened her blouse, smoothed the folds of her skirt, and walked toward his office. Her footsteps sounded unusually loud on the polished floor, echoing her anxiety. When she entered, she found him sitting behind his desk, not at the usual window but facing her, papers spread across the surface in what looked like organized chaos. For a moment he didn't speak. He simply looked at her, studying her as if he were trying to read her mind. She felt vulnerable under that gaze, a sensation she wasn't used to, even with years of professional experience behind her. Finally, he broke the silence. "We need to talk about last night," he said quietly, but there was no anger or frustration in his tone. Instead, it carried weight, a heaviness she couldn't quite place. She swallowed nervously. "About the gala?" "Yes," he said. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Not the gala itself, but why I asked you to pretend to be my wife. I need you to understand something." She felt her heart skip a beat. She had waited for this moment, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Curiosity, fear, and a strange sense of anticipation mixed inside her. "I'm listening," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. He exhaled slowly. "It's not just about appearances. You know how the media can be. You know how people assume things, spread rumors, and twist stories for their benefit. The gala was more than a charity event. It was a way to protect my personal life from scrutiny. There are things in my past, things that could affect the company if they became public. I needed someone by my side who could understand discretion, someone who could be present without asking questions." Her mind was racing. She hadn't expected him to explain himself in such detail, and hearing this made her heart ache for him in a way she couldn't quite describe. He was a man who controlled everything in his life, yet even he had vulnerabilities. Even he needed protection. "I didn't know," she whispered, the words almost escaping before she could stop them. She had been thinking all this time that the gala was a simple role to play, an unusual request from a demanding boss. She hadn't realized the weight behind it, the personal stakes that had forced him to make such a request. "I know you didn't," he said softly, "and that's why I trusted you. You didn't ask questions, you didn't try to pry, and you carried yourself with respect. Not many people could have done what you did. Not many people would have agreed, let alone executed it as well as you did." She felt a warmth spread through her chest, but it was complicated. It wasn't just pride in being appreciated. It was also empathy, the recognition that he had exposed a side of himself few ever saw. She realized that pretending to be his wife wasn't about romance or about crossing boundaries. It was about trust. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. She wanted to say something, to reach across the desk and somehow bridge the distance between them, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, he stood, walking toward the large window that overlooked the city. He didn't look at her as he spoke, but his voice was calm and measured. "I don't expect anything from you beyond what you already gave. But I need you to know, not many people get to see this side of me. The part that's not about business, the part that's human." She nodded, her throat tight. She could feel the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. This wasn't about a game, a role, or a simple request. It was about connection and trust and human vulnerability that few were allowed to witness. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked softly, her voice almost breaking the quiet between them. He finally turned to look at her, and she could see it in his eyes, the uncertainty, the need for someone to understand, even if just for a moment, "because you deserve to know. I don't want you to think it was just a whim or a strange request made on a random night. It wasn't. It was necessary, yes, but it was also personal, and I think you needed to understand that too." She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. This wasn't about emotion or about crossing professional boundaries. It was about respect, about honesty, and somehow, in a way she hadn't expected, it made her care about him more. Not romantically, not yet, but as a person. A human being behind the billionaire persona. "I understand," she said finally. Her voice was quiet but steady. "And I respect that. I wasn't sure what I was stepping into." He nodded as if he had anticipated that. "I know. That's why I asked you to follow one simple rule. No questions. Sometimes you don't need to understand everything. Sometimes you just need to be there, and that's enough." The simplicity of the rule struck her. One rule. That was all he asked, and yet it carried so much weight. It wasn't about obedience or control or submission. It was about trust, about letting someone be present without needing to dissect every detail, every motive. She found herself thinking about the gala again, the way she had carried herself, the way she had followed his lead without hesitation. She realized that in that one night something had shifted. She had begun to see him as more than her boss. He had begun to see her as more than an assistant. There was a knock on the door, breaking the moment. His assistant peeked in, reminding him of a meeting. He nodded, and she could see the shift as he returned to his professional role, the vulnerability retreating behind the polished exterior that everyone else saw. As she left the office, she felt a strange mix of relief and longing. The conversation had clarified many things, yet it had opened doors to questions she didn't know how to answer. She understood now why he had asked her to pretend, why he had insisted on one simple rule, and yet she couldn't ignore the curiosity, the connection, and the subtle bond that had formed in those brief hours. Throughout the next few days, their interactions returned to normal, but the air between them was different. There was a quiet understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of the night they had shared and the truths they had faced. She found herself watching him more closely, noticing the small gestures, the quiet moments of thought, the way he interacted with others. And in those moments she realized that the billionaire was more than his reputation. He was a man with fears, with needs, and with a desire for someone to stand by him, even just for one night, and she knew deep down that the night had changed something, not just for him, but for her as well. She didn't know what would come next, but she understood that trust, even for a single night, could alter the dynamics of any relationship, and for the first time she wondered if that trust could grow into something more, something neither of them had expected. The days after the gala passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Life returned to normal in the office, yet the memory of that night lingered in both their minds. They interacted as they always had, exchanging emails, attending meetings, and handling schedules. But beneath the professional routine, there was an unspoken awareness of what had occurred. A subtle tension, a quiet bond, something that had shifted between them. She noticed it in the way he glanced at her from across the office, not the casual glance of a boss checking on his assistant, but a look that lingered just for a moment before he quickly returned to his work. It wasn't intrusive. It was almost cautious, careful. She found herself stealing glances at him too, curious and unsettled by the intensity she saw there. The night of pretending, of following his request without question, had left them both in a state of awareness, each recognizing the other in ways they hadn't before. The morning of the first important board meeting after the gala, she walked into his office and found him reviewing documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Good morning," he said. There was nothing unusual in the words themselves, but the tone was lighter, softer, as if carrying a quiet acknowledgement of the night they had shared. "Morning," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart beat faster than usual. She set down the folder she was carrying and glanced at the papers spread on his desk. "Everything ready for the meeting?" He nodded. "Almost. I just need your help with the last-minute details." He gestured toward the papers. She moved closer, and as she leaned over to organize them, she caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of her eye. He wasn't looking at the papers. He was watching her. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her feel noticed. Truly noticed. The meeting itself was long and tense, filled with negotiations, questions, and decisions that would affect the future of the company. She stayed in her role, taking notes, assisting where necessary, and keeping interactions professional. Yet all the while there was an unspoken presence between them, a quiet understanding that went beyond words. After the meeting, he asked her to stay behind. They walked together to his office, and she noticed the subtle change in his posture. He was usually composed, even detached, but there was a weight in his movements today, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Once inside, he closed the door and gestured for her to sit. He leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. "I want to apologize for putting you in that position," he said quietly. "Asking you to pretend it wasn't fair to you. You could have refused." She shook her head. "No, it wasn't about fairness or rules. I chose to do it because I trusted you, and because I understood at least a little why it was necessary. It wasn't easy, but I don't regret it." He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady, searching. "You understand more than anyone else could, and that means more than you realize." There was a softness to his voice that made her pause, something genuine and human beneath the layers of his public persona. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled with a quiet acknowledgement of the trust they had shared. Then, as if realizing the weight of the conversation, he straightened and moved toward his desk. "I also want you to know that what happened at the gala, it doesn't change our professional boundaries. I respect you and I respect your role here. Nothing should make you feel otherwise." She nodded, appreciating his words. "I know, and I respect you too. I can't help but feel that night changed something between us." Even if it was just for a few hours, he smiled faintly. Yes, it did. The acknowledgement was simple, but it carried a depth that neither of them could ignore. They had crossed into a space that was neither fully professional nor fully personal, and the residue of that night remained, quiet but undeniable. Over the next few weeks, they continued to work closely, their interactions tinged with subtle familiarity. There were moments when he would linger in conversation just a little longer than necessary, moments when she caught him looking at her with a quiet intensity that made her heart skip. But always the professionalism remained. They navigated the balance between personal connection and workplace boundaries with care, each conscious of the fragile line they walked. One evening, as the office emptied and the city lights glowed outside the window, he asked her to join him in the conference room. She followed, curious. He gestured for her to sit, then closed the blinds, dimming the room into a soft, private space. "I've been thinking about the gala," he said, his voice low. "Not the event itself, but the way things unfolded. The trust you showed, the way you handled everything. It wasn't just professional. You handled it with grace, with dignity. You showed a strength that I didn't expect." She felt a warmth in her chest, but also a nervous tension. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It was just one night. I did what I could, he shook his head. It was more than that. And it's made me realize something important. That night, it made me see what I've been missing. I've always focused on business, on success, on appearances. But in doing so, I've neglected something human. I've neglected trust, connection, and understanding. You reminded me of that even if you didn't intend to. She looked at him, surprised by his honesty. The man who had always seemed so composed, so in control, was revealing vulnerability, a side of him few ever saw. I didn't realize I had that effect, she admitted. You did, he said simply. His gaze held hers, steady and sincere. And I don't want to ignore it. But I also know we need to proceed carefully. Nothing should jeopardize your role or mine. They sat in silence, the weight of unspoken thoughts filling the room. She felt a sense of closeness, a subtle connection that had grown over weeks and months, beginning with a single, unusual request. Finally, she spoke. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that night changed me too. It made me see you differently, not just as my boss, but as a person. Someone who has his own struggles, his own vulnerabilities. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Yes, and I see you differently as well. Not just as my assistant, but as someone remarkable, strong, capable, and trustworthy. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet. It was something deeper, a recognition of human connection, of shared trust and understanding. And in that quiet acknowledgement, both of them realized that the boundaries they had always maintained were shifting, imperceptibly, but irrevocably. Over the following months, their relationship evolved. They continued to work together professionally, maintaining the structure and expectations of the office. But there were subtle changes, a touch on the arm when passing in the hallway, a glance that lingered longer than necessary, a quiet conversation that extended beyond work matters. The night of the gala, the unusual request and the rule of no questions had created a foundation of trust that neither could ignore. It was not a story of instant romance or dramatic declarations. It was a story of human connection, of understanding, of trust. They had shared a moment that transcended roles, a night that revealed their vulnerabilities and strengths, and in doing so, had brought them closer in ways neither expected. And as they navigated the complex world of business, media, and high society, they carried that night with them, a reminder that even in the most controlled environments, human connection, honesty, and trust could create bonds stronger than power, wealth, or influence. It was a beginning, not defined by words or titles, but by the quiet understanding between two people who had seen each other, truly seen each other, and had chosen to respect and honor that vision. It was a trust forged in one night of pretending, but lasting far beyond, shaping the way they saw each other, and perhaps the way they would move forward together.